I'm Chance Dorland, and this is In-Depth, an interview program from expressnews.com where you'll find in-depth reporting and other resources for every topic discussed right here on the podcast. Now, earlier this year, the San Antonio Firefighters Association successfully collected enough signatures to put 3 charter amendments on the November ballot. Now, that act itself, of course, is newsworthy. But those simple words I just said may be the easiest piece of this puzzle that continues to unfold, now dealing with counter campaigns, lawsuits, and even allegations of breaking Texas state law. So to explore the thinking behind the amendments, talk about the players on both sides and how this story continues to unfold as we near Election Day, I'm joined now by San Antonio Express News senior reporter Josh Baugh. So, Josh, you're, of course, one of the weekly hosts of our politics show, Plural Politics. Check it out at expressnews.com/podcasts. So thank you for joining me and playing double duty in the podcast world this week. I actually thought for a while about how to begin our conversation today because it is so complicated, I guess would be the easiest way to put it. And I figured out the best way would be to start with just 2 words, and those are Chris Steele. So who is he and how is he involved in this topic?
So Chris Steele is the longtime president of the San Antonio Professional Firefighters Association. He's been involved with the union for many, many years. And my colleague, Brian Chasnoff, who's a columnist here, had actually written a really interesting column recently that explored Steele a little bit deeper. And he had an interview with both the city manager, Cheryl Scully, and the fire chief, Charles Hood, who told Brian about this incident that occurred about 10 years ago. It was during a meeting at City Hall, and it was a briefing that the city manager had done on behalf of the city for the public safety unions for Steele and his counterpart at the San Antonio Police Officers Association. And after that meeting, Cheryl Scully alleges that Chris Steele told her that basically he was a soldier without a war and that he was willing to lie in order to gin up controversy so that he could prove his value to his members. He has kind of mildly denied that in some areas, but he's not come up with a kind of full-throated reaction, just kind of ultimately saying that did not happen. And so that's kind of the backdrop in which this all begins to come together. He pushed backing up the firefighters and police officers in San Antonio work under what's called a collective bargaining agreement. It's a contract that the unions negotiate with the city. They're multi-year contracts and built into them in every contract since the inception of collective bargaining in San Antonio dating back to the late 1970s. They've had these so-called evergreen clauses, which mean that the contract stays intact even once it expires for up to 10 years. And so the firefighters and the police officers' contracts expired back on September 30th of 2014. Leading up to that expiration, the mayor and the city manager and other city officials had begun beating the drum about the skyrocketing cost of healthcare, and they had made it a point to say that they were going to negotiate into these new contracts that these public safety personnel would begin paying some portion of their health care. So as it stood at the time, they had 100% coverage for themselves and their dependents, their spouses, which is something that's almost unheard of this age. And so it got to be extremely controversial for both unions. The police officers went to the negotiating table. Lawsuits had been filed by the city trying to claim that the evergreen was unconstitutional. And ultimately, it's been a year or two now, a couple of years, I guess, the Police Officers Association agreed to a contract, and they're now paying a portion of the health care for their dependents. They still get health care for themselves for free, but they have to pay a little bit in. And so that was somewhat of a victory for the city. The the lawsuit, meanwhile, against the fire union had gone all the way up to the Texas Supreme Court. And as this was unraveling, Chris Steele said, we're not going to come to the table to negotiate a new contract under the threat of litigation. And so that litigation had been going on and on and on. And so there was not really a resolution, and neither side was coming to the table. The city was making offers, let's start negotiating. They were being rejected or ignored by the fire union. And the city continued to elevate its lawsuit through the court system. And so earlier this year, when early voting for the primaries began, Chris Steele announced that the fire union was launching this campaign called San Antonio First, and that they were going to go out and get signatures for these 3 charter amendments that are going to be on the November 6th ballot. So there's one that addresses referendum. There's one that addresses city manager pay and tenure. And there's one that would force the city into binding arbitration on contract issues with the fire department, with the fire union, as opposed to going through the court system as they've done in the past. They got their signatures. They filed them with the city clerk, and I wrote a couple stories in July pointing out that they had never disclosed the money that they'd spent. So we knew that campaign that took place in the spring was being paid for by the firefighters, but they never disclosed through the Texas Ethics Commission or the city clerk's office here that they'd spent any money on that campaign. And so I wrote a series of stories indicating that they never disclosed that, and raising the question as to whether it was illegal expenditures, because the PAC that they maintain, the Political Action Committee, didn't have enough money to cover the cost that we had been told that was associated with this campaign. So they spent $510,000 obtaining these signatures on these petitions. And so that started another whole issue of lawsuits. And so after my series of stories ran that indicated they hadn't disclosed, and then when that story ran, the fire union immediately amended their filings with the Texas Ethics Commission, claiming that they had received $510,000 in in-kind contributions from the Central Texas firm that had run their petition campaign. That was inaccurate. And I pointed that out and pointed out that their PAC didn't have enough money in it to cover the $500,000 that they'd spent. And so then they filed later. They said, well, we messed up, and the in-kind contribution was actually an expense by the fire union. And so ultimately they filed another document that stated that the union had spent its own money in a direct expenditure on this campaign. So there is now a opposition political action committee called Secure San Antonio's Future. It's run by a couple of high profile political consultants from San Antonio, and it represents the city hall, the business industry, the business community, community groups that are in opposition to these charter amendments. And after my stories ran, they filed a lawsuit against the fire union, alleging that they had illegally spent union dues. And so that had kind of been litigated, kind of not. So they were seeking a temporary injunction to prevent the city council from taking action, calling the election, which is to take place on November 6th. And the district court judge denied the request for a temporary restraining order. So they appealed that. The Fourth Court of Appeals denied it. They appealed to the Texas Supreme Court, and the Texas Supreme Court rejected taking the case. And so the election is definitely going to happen on November 6th. But there's a question remaining as to whether the opposition PAC is going to continue litigation and fight the merits of the case, because really there wasn't a ruling on whether the expenditure was illegal. There was a ruling on whether a judge would enjoin the city from calling the election. So that's kind of where we're at. The PAC on last Saturday launched their campaign at an event at La Villita, and there's some controversy over that because a council office, council aides sent out an email that invited East Side community leaders to go to this political event. But it never actually referenced the event, and it never talked about voting. It never talked about charter amendments. It just said that there was an important event that would discuss important issues for the city, and come listen and eat some free breakfast tacos. So the union got really upset with that and said it was unethical, and they were asking for people to file ethics complaints. That's taken place. So somebody read their Facebook post, and either one or more people filed ethics complaints against this council office. And so we're now seeing, we're at this point where the campaigns are kind of ramping up. The Go Vote No campaign is out in full force. They've got tons of signage. The fire unions campaign is ramping up. They've got Twitter now. They're starting to be more active. And so I think that in the next 50 something days, we're going to see a lot of this coming back and forth play out.
Now, Josh, you've really laid out a lot of the really, really important details when it comes to this story. I want to go back through some of those and maybe put a finer point on them. And specifically, we started talking about just those two words, Chris Steele, and we just went into all that. Now, just one word, amendments. I'd like you to talk about the 3 amendments and talk about specifically what they would do for firefighters and why people oppose them.
So that's a pretty interesting question, because what would they do for firefighters? And so if you set aside, let's talk first about the one that does actually have an impact on the firefighters, and that's the binding arbitration. So what they want is an amendment that gives the firefighters union sole discretion to declare when they're at impasse with the city on negotiations. And when they make that declaration, that automatically would trigger putting together an arbitration panel that would listen to arguments from both sides and then make a binding decision that both sides would have to agree to on those contract matters. And so that one actually does have impact on their healthcare, so on and so forth. The history shows that firefighters, so they use arbitration in disputes over punishment. So if a firefighter does something and gets suspended without pay, that firefighter can appeal that decision that's made by the fire chief to a board to an arbitrator, and that arbitrator can actually overturn a decision that's made by the chief. And so they have a good track record with, and police and fire both, I think, have a good track record with arbitration. And so people who are against that amendment are against it primarily because there's a big question mark as to whether a charter can prevent a municipal government from having the right to go to court on matters that fall within its purview. And so if that is passed by voters, I think there's going to probably be a legal challenge, would be my guess, at the first time that the firefighters try to use that impasse and binding arbitration. I think that the city would probably file a lawsuit saying this is unconstitutional. Now, going back to the top of the list is the referendum. And so state law dictates for a charter amendment to be placed on the ballot that you get 20,000 signatures. It's a very low threshold for getting something onto the ballot. And so that's kind of the baseline. But home rule governments like the city of San Antonio can institute charters and have higher thresholds for many things, including referendum. And so currently in San Antonio, for both referendum and initiative and for recall, you have to get 10% of the number of registered voters from the previous municipal election to sign a petition. They have to be registered voters. And so that's a number right now hovering around 69,500 signatures. So if you want to overturn something that's been done by the city council, you have, I think it's 40 days to go out and get 69,500 signatures. And so it's a pretty high burden. And what the firefighters seek to do is reduce that number from that 10% threshold down to a standard 20,000 signatures and give themselves 180 days in order to collect those 20,000 signatures. So opponents of that measure, and I think another incredibly important element is the charter currently prohibits referendum on appropriations and rates, tax levies. And so the most important fundamental stuff that the city government does, setting of a tax rate, setting of utility rates, and spending money on projects, that's all prohibited. You can't overturn that through referendum right now. The charter amendment proposed by the firefighters would take away those prohibitions and basically open up absolutely any decision that's made by the city council for being overturned. And opponents say that 20,000 signature threshold opens up the city to special interests attacking or using the threat of referendum to leverage decisions out of the council. The firefighters say this is bringing democracy back to City Hall, but a lot of people don't see it that way, including the Texas Organizing Project, which is a grassroots progressive organization that we reported in today's paper, came out against a couple of these propositions, saying they're bad for the city of San Antonio. So the third proposition is the city manager proposition. The firefighters are aiming to limit the salary of the city manager to 10 times the lowest paid city employee. So that would put that salary top end around $280,000 to $300,000 a year, which is a lot of money. And it would also put a term limit on that city manager. So future city managers, let's say there's a new one in 2019 or 2020 for easy math. No matter how great of a job that person might do in 2028, they would be forced to leave that position with no questions asked. It doesn't matter if they've been the greatest city manager in the history of San Antonio. At that 8-year mark, they're done. And people see that basically as just retaliation against the city manager for her push against the fire union and healthcare, basically. If you really want to kind of boil it down to its essence, that's kind of where it falls.
And Josh, I know something else that you've talked about a lot on the Plural Politics podcast is that not only everything that you just went through with these 3 amendments, but because of specifically the idea of kind of undoing or preventing, elected officials from passing new regulations, running the city in a way that they think is good for its citizens and good for business, that could kill the stability that has really let San Antonio gain a lot, especially when it comes to its credit rating.
Yeah, so San Antonio is the only major city in the United States that enjoys a AAA bond rating. So what that means is that every 5 years now, the city does a bond program. It's a 5-year program. And this last one was $850 million. And so that's $850 million of capital projects that are completed over a 5-year period in San Antonio. The actual, I can't tell you exactly what the number is, but the actual number that we will pay back as a city on that $850 million is in the billions. I don't know if it's 1.5 billion or $2 billion, but we pay interest on that principal amount, just like we would on a mortgage or a car payment. And so having a AAA bond rating means that we can sell debt at the very lowest possible interest rate. And so as you lose your those ratings, if you get downgraded, to a AA plus, or you go to a AA or AA minus, every time you tick down, that can be calculated to something like $35 or $40 million per tick. And so effectively what happens when your bond rating drops is that you spend less money on capital and more on interest. And so that $850 million, if we had a lesser bond rating, it would have been lower than that. It would have been down, I don't know if it would have been 800 million or 750 million, but it would be well reduced. And basically you'd be paying more money for fewer projects.
We've talked about the amendments, talked about, the leader of the San Antonio Firefighters Association, that there's a lot of history there that you've gone through, and I'm sure more of that's going to be reported on, maybe some more coming out in the coming weeks before the November election. And I correct me if I'm wrong here, but it doesn't seem like I'm going out on a limb to say that most elected officials in San Antonio seem to not be for these charter amendments. There are some groups that are against them as well. And then you have the San Antonio Firefighters Association that obviously initiated them. They're completely on board. Is there anyone else backing up the firefighters on this?
Yes. I mean, they definitely have, they have some supporters. I forget the exact name of it. It's the Bexar County or San Antonio Homeowner Taxpayer Association. It used to be a powerhouse group that's really kind of lost its thrust in San Antonio. It's led by Bob Martin, and I believe it was founded by a guy named C.A. Stubbs. And it used to be a really powerful group. These days, I don't know that they carry the same sort of cachet that they did in the past. There's a group called the Joshua Initiative. There's another group. I say group. I don't know how many members are involved. It's I think something along the lines of San Antonians Against Bureaucracies and Waste or something. Cynthia Brim, who's the embattled GOP chairwoman for Bexar County, she's been supportive. Janet Ahmad, who's a housing activist, longtime housing activist. George Alejos, who's a LULAC guy. Every time they hold a press conference, they do have a group of people there who are in support. But the big players these days, like the Texas Organizing Project, like Cops Metro, TOP has already come out against the charter amendments, and Cops Metro has not, I don't think, yet taken a position, but I hear that that's coming sometime soon. So you'd asked a little bit about elected officials in San Antonio and where they fall on this. And the vast majority of electeds in San Antonio are in opposition. There's a supermajority of the city council that oppose the charter amendments. I know that there's multiple Bexar County commissioners and I believe the county judge who are against the charter amendments. I think that it's important to note that the type of democracy that we live in this representative democracy, and we elect our leaders to make decisions on our behalf, and really trying to make decisions by public vote on absolutely everything isn't very realistic. And so we put our faith into our leaders to make these decisions. And if we don't like the decisions that our leaders make, we go to the ballot box and we vote against them, and we elect people to represent our best interests and what we believe in. And so you see a lot of that kind of manifesting in conversation with elected officials. The fire union says that they're power hungry and they're trying to retain power at all costs, and they don't listen to the people. But the Texas Organizing Project's a perfect example. They're running a parallel campaign, and they did a petition around the same time period that the firefighters did. They went out and got 144,000 signatures. They were doing an initiative which requires the 10% threshold of 69,500 signatures, not the 20,000 the firefighters did. And they went out and they got their petition signed. They got 144,000 signatures. They had submitted them, and the city council had an opportunity in that case to either approve an ordinance or deny the ordinance that they had requested through this petition, and it would automatically go on the ballot in November. And to your point about city officials and this whole discussion about whether they are reactive and they listen to their constituents, they took the signatures at face value and adopted that ordinance. And so you have examples. The city council just approved the budget, and there was a lot of public input on what the public wanted their tax dollars to go to, and you saw that manifest in the fiscal year 2019 budget. So, there are a lot of examples of local elected officials being responsive to their constituents, and if you take that away and you do everything by referendum, it jeopardizes stability, which is what the bond rating agencies look at and you start to see those bond ratings go down.
And then finally, Josh, we've kind of hit our limit for today's episode, and I certainly want to give your voice a breather, but I have you right now. I want to ask a final question. Do you have any predictions on this, or maybe what's the next thing you're looking for in the development of this story? Obviously, we have some time until early November.
We do have some time, but it's going to come a lot quicker than anybody expects. And I don't have a prediction. I think that it's a coin toss at this point. I think that the opposition PAC did some polling when they first organized, and it showed that if the election were held a couple of months ago, that these charter amendments would pass overwhelmingly. But traditionally, voters don't start really paying attention to items and campaigns that are going to be on the ballot until this period now. And so I think that from this point forward, we're going to have to pay really close attention to how the public is reacting. I think both campaigns are going to be vigorous. And at this point, I think it's an even kind of even odds for both sides. And I think probably whoever does a better job of getting out there and knocking on doors and educating voters and doing so in a way that they believe, I think that's going to be what turns the tables on this.
And a big thank you for that very long, very detailed explanation from San Antonio Express News senior reporter Josh Baugh, who joined me on today's episode of the In-Depth podcast, an interview program from expressnews.com. For the San Antonio Express News, I'm Chance Dorland.